this episode, we ease into the ISSAP journey by getting very clear on what you are actually being tested on and why that matters for how you study. A lot of learners start with the most interesting topics first, and then feel surprised when practice questions seem to come from a different universe. But that disconnect is usually caused by not reading the blueprint like a map. The exam blueprint is not a marketing description, and it is not a reading list, because it is a structured statement of what knowledge and judgment the exam expects you to demonstrate. When you learn to interpret it, you stop guessing what is important, and you start practicing the kinds of thinking the exam rewards. By the end of this lesson, you should feel comfortable looking at the blueprint, understanding what domain weights really imply, and recognizing the most common question styles so you can prepare with fewer surprises and more confidence. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first idea to lock in is what a blueprint actually represents in an exam context, because it is easy to treat it like a table of contents and accidentally misuse it. A blueprint is a set of claims about scope, meaning what topics are fair game, and depth, meaning how well you must understand those topics to answer correctly. It also signals the exam's view of professional competence, which is about making safe, defensible decisions rather than memorizing trivia. For a security architecture credential, the blueprint tends to emphasize principles, trade-offs, and the ability to connect requirements to design outcomes. That means the blueprint is telling you not only what to learn, but also the kind of reasoning you need to practice while learning it. If you treat it as a checklist of terms, you may know a lot of words while still missing the exam's real target, which is architectural judgment. Now think about domains as buckets of responsibility rather than isolated chapters, because the exam is built around how work is actually organized. A domain groups a set of decisions and artifacts that naturally belong together, such as turning business goals into security requirements or designing controls that meet those requirements at scale. For beginners, the mistake is to study domains as silos and then get confused by questions that blend ideas across them. Security architecture is inherently cross-domain because a design choice about identity might affect monitoring, and a legal obligation might constrain how you segment networks or store data. The blueprint helps you see these connections by listing topics that often appear together in practice. When you read a domain, try to imagine what kind of architectural work products it would produce, like a reference architecture, a set of patterns, a set of requirements, or a decision record that explains trade-offs. Domain weights are the next piece, and they can be misunderstood in a way that wastes months of study time. A weight is not a promise that you will see a certain number of questions about a narrow subtopic, and it is not a guarantee that you can ignore a low-weight area. Instead, a weight is a rough signal of how much of the exam's total scoring emphasis is placed on that domain's knowledge and decision skills. In practical terms, weights tell you where to invest extra repetition, extra practice questions, and extra review sessions, because that is where small improvements yield bigger score impact. At the same time, even a lightly weighted domain can contain foundational concepts that appear indirectly in other domains, so neglecting it can still hurt you. A good mental model is that weights guide priority, not permission to skip, and they should influence your study rhythm rather than your curiosity. To use weights well, you need to translate them into a study plan that matches how learning actually sticks, which is about spacing and retrieval rather than long reading sessions. If one domain is heavier, that does not mean you cram it once, because architecture thinking improves by revisiting the same ideas in different contexts. Instead, you give the heavier domain more touches across weeks, more practice questions, and more opportunities to explain it in your own words. For lighter domains, you still schedule regular contact so the knowledge stays available, but you spend less total time there. This approach prevents the common failure mode where learners master their favorite topics early, forget them later, and then panic when practice exams reveal gaps. Weights become a calibration tool that keeps your effort proportional across the entire blueprint while still respecting what matters most. A closely related concept is cognitive level, which is a simple way to describe whether a question is testing recall, understanding, or application and judgment. Exams like this are rarely satisfied with pure recall, even though recall is necessary as a foundation. You may need to remember what a principle means, but you will be asked to use that principle to evaluate a design choice, recognize a risk, or choose the best next step given constraints. When the blueprint lists a topic, imagine what it would look like at an application level, such as deciding between two controls based on risk, cost, and operational impact. Beginners often assume that knowing definitions is enough because definitions feel concrete, but the exam often rewards the ability to connect definitions to consequences. When you study, ask yourself not only what something is, but also what it affects, what it depends on, and what could go wrong if it is misunderstood. Another way to decode the blueprint is to look for verbs and implied actions, even if the blueprint is written in neutral topic language. If a domain is about architecture, the implied verbs are things like define, align, integrate, validate, document, justify, and govern. Those verbs are hints about the mental moves you will need in questions, such as identifying the most appropriate control objective or choosing the best architectural pattern for a requirement. This is important because it shifts your study from passive recognition to active decision-making. You want to practice turning a short scenario into an architectural problem statement, then filtering choices through constraints and priorities. When you can do that consistently, practice questions start to feel less like tricks and more like structured puzzles with rules you understand. With that foundation, it helps to understand how exam questions are written because the style can influence how you read and how you manage time. Many questions are scenario-based, meaning they give you a small story about an organization, a system, or a problem, and then ask you to choose the best answer. Scenario questions are not asking you to fix everything, and they are not asking for a perfect world, because the scenario often includes limitations like legacy systems, tight budgets, or conflicting stakeholder needs. The phrase best is doing a lot of work, because multiple answers may be technically possible, but only one fits the scenario's priorities most cleanly. Beginners sometimes get stuck because they look for the answer they personally like, rather than the answer that best matches the stated constraints. Training yourself to treat scenario text as requirements and constraints, not background flavor, makes you faster and more accurate. You will also encounter questions that feel like concept checks, where the scenario is minimal and the goal is to confirm that you understand a principle or a relationship. These questions can still be tricky because they often include answer options that are almost correct but subtly incomplete, overly broad, or misaligned with architectural thinking. For example, an option might describe a control that is real but belongs at a different layer, or it might be a good operational practice that does not satisfy the architectural requirement in the prompt. A useful habit is to restate the question in your own words before you look at the answers, so you are clear about what is being asked. Then evaluate each option as a claim and ask whether it directly addresses the problem, whether it introduces new risks, and whether it matches the role of an architect rather than an operator. This keeps you from getting pulled into tempting details that are not actually relevant. A particularly important ISSAP-style skill is distinguishing between architecture decisions and implementation tasks, because many incorrect answers sound like things a technical person might do next. The exam wants you to think like an architect, which means you focus on designing, aligning, and governing rather than configuring or troubleshooting. That does not mean you ignore technical reality, because good architecture respects what can be built and operated, but the perspective is different. If a scenario is asking for the best architectural approach, an answer that jumps straight to a specific configuration step is often too low level. Conversely, an answer that is so high level that it does not constrain anything is often too vague to be helpful. You are usually looking for the option that sets direction, defines requirements, selects patterns, or establishes controls in a way that guides implementation without pretending to be the implementation. Because of that, it helps to recognize common distractor patterns, which are answer choices designed to look plausible while being wrong for specific reasons. One distractor type is the true statement that does not answer the question, like a correct security fact that is irrelevant to the scenario's core constraint. Another is the overly absolute answer, which uses language that sounds decisive but ignores trade-offs, such as always or never in situations where architecture is about balancing priorities. A third is the backwards order answer, which suggests doing later stage activities before earlier stage ones, like implementing controls before validating requirements or understanding risk. There are also answers that confuse goals with controls, like describing an objective but not how it would be met, or describing a control but not linking it to the objective. When you practice, you can train your eyes to spot these patterns quickly, which saves time and reduces second-guessing. Time management on the exam is closely tied to question style, because some questions invite deep thinking and others should be answered quickly if you recognize the pattern. A good strategy is to build a two-pass mindset in your practice sessions, even if you are not simulating the exam yet. On the first pass, aim to answer efficiently by focusing on the prompt, the constraints, and the best fit option, and avoid getting stuck trying to perfect every detail. On the second pass, revisit flagged questions with fresh attention, because many errors come from misreading one key phrase or overlooking one constraint. This habit trains you to keep moving without feeling like you are abandoning carefulness. It also reduces the stress that can build when you spend too long on an early question and then feel rushed later. Another powerful way to use the blueprint is to create a personal crosswalk between blueprint topics and the kinds of mental tasks you need to perform. For instance, if a topic involves governance, you should practice questions that ask you to assign accountability, define decision rights, and ensure traceability. If a topic involves risk, you should practice weighing likelihood and impact, comparing treatment options, and documenting rationale. If a topic involves architecture patterns, you should practice choosing the right pattern under constraints and predicting downstream effects on operations and assurance. You are not making an outline here. You are creating mental muscles connected to each area of the blueprint. When you do this, you stop treating practice questions as random and start using them as targeted drills. That is how you convert the blueprint from a static document into an active training tool. A final piece of decoding is learning what the exam assumes about your baseline, because that affects how you interpret questions and answer choices. The exam generally assumes you understand core security concepts and can apply them in design, but it does not reward obscure facts that do not change decisions. When you see an option that depends on a narrow fact, ask whether that fact would realistically determine an architectural choice or whether it is a distraction. Also pay attention to how the exam frames success, which often includes maintainability, auditability, and alignment with business goals, not just technical strength. Beginners sometimes pick the most locked-down answer because it feels safest, but architecture also cares about usability, resilience, and the ability to operate at scale. The best answer is usually the one that reduces risk responsibly while respecting real constraints and long-term sustainability. As you bring all of this together, your immediate goal is to turn the blueprint, weights, and question styles into a simple habit you repeat every week. You read the blueprint not to memorize it, but to remind yourself what the exam values and where your time should go. You use domain weights to allocate repetition and practice, not to skip anything, and you treat question styles as training for how to read, not just what to know. When you miss a practice question, you diagnose whether it was a content gap, a misread constraint, a role confusion between architecture and implementation, or a time pressure mistake. That diagnosis tells you what to adjust next, which is far more useful than just marking an answer wrong. The point of this lesson is that the exam is not a mystery if you learn to read its signals, and those signals let you prepare with intention instead of hope.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.